Chapter 45. Mazen. Mazen turned the corner and blanched at the sight before him. At the end of the hall was a doorway that led into a room filled with mountains of gold, the treasure chamber. And coming from that chamber, the scream. Mazen had never heard an agony so loud, so bare. The midnight merchant. Panic gripped his heart. The scream came again, a sob-riddled wail that sent shivers up his spine. He pulled his shadow around him and paused at the open doors. The chamber was whole, no gaps, no natural light. There was only the firelight from the sconces. Imad and the merchant were barely illuminated by the hazy glow. Luli lay unmoving on the floor, the stars on her robes lost beneath a constellation of blood splatters. Imad circled her like a vulture in Omar's body, twirling a knife in his fingers. Mazen surged forward. He had no plan. He had no time. He didn't see the ghoul until it was too late, until they were shrieking and rushing toward him. He kept running, even as the human men shifted and Iman searched the emptiness for him. Mazen crashed into him before he could attack the merchant, slapping the knife out of his hand. It was all he managed before he was jumped from behind. He tumbled, and the shadow cloak collapsed to the floor. One man reached for it, while another pinned him to the ground. "Won't come off," he said to Imad. Search the perimeter for Bint Luas. When he looked at Mazen, his gaze, Omar's gaze, was terrifyingly blank. "So we meet again, Prince. You've made quite a mess of things." The fire behind Imad flickered and dimmed. The blood on the merchant's clothing looked garish beneath its light. Mazen quivered. "What have you done to her?" "Anyone with eyes can see." Imad reached out and grabbed him by the shirt. Mazen saw a dagger in his hand. It was a different weapon than the one he'd knocked away, a dagger with a gold letter embedded into the hilt. "I made the mistake of underestimating you once, Prince, but not again. If I must drag your brother here to avenge your corpse, so be it." He raised the knife. It flashed through the air faster than Mazen could scream. He felt the coldness of it against his skin, and nothing. Slowly, he eased his eyes open. The blade had been sharp before, but now it was inexplicably crescent-shaped. Its point curved away from his throat. Mazen was still staring when Imad stabbed him again, and he saw the moment the blade hit his chest and bent. Imad's face paled. "What?" The fire behind them wavered again. It turned a deep and ominous green. Imad spun, clutching at something hidden beneath his cloak. Mazen saw a chain hanging from his neck, a glimmer of gold between his fingers. An amulet. "Attend me," Imad whispered as he grasped the amulet. His nervous gaze swept across the room. When he next spoke, the guttural syllables of the ghoul language came from his mouth, but the ghouls surrounding the perimeter did not respond. They were frozen, their heads tilted eerily as if they were listening for something. There was movement, not from the fire, which danced wildly on the sconces as if possessed, but from the knife still in Imad's hand. Mazen saw a pair of blazing eyes blink at him from the surface of the blade. Behind them, the entrance doors slammed shut, and the fire in the room dimmed, sighed, and died, plunging them into darkness. The chamber went eerily silent. And then an invisible force swept through the room like a whirlwind, pressing the air from Mazen's lungs. Chaos unfurled in every direction. Mazen heard the slap of hurried footsteps, the hiss of murmured curses. He heard Imad speaking in the discord with Omar's voice. "What sorcery is this? Who—" The thief gasped. "No, no!" Somewhere nearby there came an inhuman howl. Mazen heard the chattering of ghouls in the darkness, shuffling, tearing, and then a scream. Imad was mumbling what sounded like a fervent prayer beneath his breath. Mazen heard the thief stumble, and something metal clattered to the floor. Imad's blade? Mazen reached for it. In his grasp it was no longer crescent-shaped, but there a pair of red eyes blinked at him from the faintly glowing surface. "Well," said the voice in his mind, "are you just going to sit there?" Mazen recognized the voice, the eyes. It was impossible, and yet not impossible. Jinn do not die like humans. He squinted into the dark. "Al-Naziri?" "Lu." Fingers wrapped around his wrist from behind. Mazen whirled in a panic. He relaxed only when, in the dim light coming from the blade, he saw Luli staring at him with glassy eyes. The moment she saw the knife, she clawed it out of his hands. Mazen took in the blood on her scarves, her robe. She had never looked so small, so exhausted. You need to, we need to get out of here, he said gently. Can you move? A muscle feathered in her jaw. She shook her head. Mazen glanced at her feet, but he was unable to see anything beneath the bloodied hem of her robe. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I'm going to pick you up, okay? The merchant said nothing as he curved an arm under her legs and set a hand on her back. She only pressed a palm to his chest as he rose. He wasn't sure if he or she was trembling more as he turned and stumbled through the dark. The blade, as if to conceal them, had stopped emitting light, making it impossible to see anything, including the exit. The darkness was impenetrable. Mazen barely managed a few steps before he froze, overwhelmed by the invisible chaos. He heard ghouls wailing, men yelling, swords screeching. The merchant nudged him, then pressed something round into his hands. Mazen ran his fingers over glass, wood, a compass. He remembered the instrument in Imad's hands. How in the world had Lily taken it from him? Before he could ask, a strange thing happened. The wood beneath his fingers began to warm, and a familiar song pounded through his head. The stars, they burn the night and guide the sheik's way. The words faded. He was drowning, chained to a boulder, falling beneath the water. The memory abruptly dissipated. My apologies. He stopped breathing when he heard the voice in his head. I thought you were someone else, said the Queen of Dunes. I confess, all human men look the same to me. His mind spun. The voice definitely belonged to the Queen of Dunes, but how? Had Imad stolen the collar from the merchant's bag and brought it with him? The question was replaced with a more perplexing realization. For some reason, he suddenly knew how to navigate his way through the dark room. It was as if there was an arrow in his mind, pointing him toward the exit. By the time he stumbled into the doors, the magic was making his blood hum. He was dizzy as the merchant took the compass back from him and reached for the door, and then drew away with a soundless gasp as the blade in her hand brightened, revealing one of Ahmad's men standing guard. He blinked, discombobulated in the hazy light. You think you can get past me, Prince? The man raised his weapon. It was at that exact moment the doors behind him burst open. The killer was knocked off his feet and stabbed in the back. Aisha stood behind him, clutching the sword driven through his chest. Her wide-eyed gaze met Mazen's. What are you doing? Run! Luli's grip on him tightened as he ducked out of the room and rushed after Aisha, back into the halls blessedly lit by torches. He turned back only once to witness Imad's companions giving chase. The moment he and Aisha turned the corner, she stopped him and said, You're not moving fast enough. Give me your shadow. Mazen frowned. I can't just give you my shadow. You can peel it off the wall, can't you? She gestured impatiently. Hand it over. Mazen reached for the shadow. He pried it from the wall and, shoving aside his hesitation, threw it at Aisha. He was shocked when she actually disappeared. She seemed just as surprised, though her reaction was short-lived, fading as she shifted the shadow cloak onto her shoulder. She held out a hand to the merchant. I'll take your dagger as well. Luli's glare turned murderous. She shook her head. If I'm going to buy you time, I need a weapon. Give me the dagger. Aisha reached for the weapon. Mazen yelped when it burst into flame in Luli's hands. Aisha pulled her hand away. Shit! Luli stared at the fire, blinking rapidly. For a few moments, she was still, her gaze unfocused as she looked at the blade. But then she seemed to come back to herself. She shoved the dagger at Aisha without comment. The thief gasped when she wrapped her fingers around the hilt. It has a voice. She paused, face paling. Wait, is this? Yes. Mazen backed up a step. It's Kadir. Don't lose him. Aisha nodded, pulled the shadow over her head, and disappeared. Mazen heard the soft patter of her footsteps, and then the surprised yells of men falling on to an invisible wraith. He resumed fleeing. For the first time since escaping the chamber, he glanced at the compass. The metal arrow in his hand had disappeared when Luli put the compass on her lap. But he could still read the compass in her cupped hands. The twitching arrow guided them down a flight of stairs, pointing decisively ahead. He remembered what Imad had said about its power. Is this a king's relic? He glanced down at the merchant. Luli shrugged. Mazen paused, realizing she had yet to speak. He glanced at her throat, at the shackle and the chain hanging from it. His heart clenched at the sight. The reason you can't speak. She touched a finger to the band. And can't walk? She pressed her lips together and said nothing. Imad. Mazen swallowed his anger and focused on following the compass, on moving through the ruined corridors, pushing in flimsy wooden doors with his foot, and why was the relic leading him deeper into the ruins? He stopped, noticing for the first time the way the walls pressed in on them. The gaps and holes he'd become so accustomed to were absent. They had reached a dead end. Al-Nazari, he said softly. His voice was barely a croak. Where are we? But the merchant looked just as confused. She shook her head, face pale. I should have gone out the way I came in, but the sand sea... He fell back against the wall, despair and exhaustion washing over him. The merchant tugged on his sleeve, a silent question in her eyes. He realized she didn't know that they were surrounded by the sand sea, that if there was an escape, he didn't know where it was. He looked frantically around them, but there were no doors, no passages, no escape. His gaze fell to the floor and snagged on his shadow. Mazen blinked. If his shadow had returned, then Aisha... End of the line, Prince. Mazen whirled to see Ahmad standing behind him, still in Omar's body, and flanked by human men. One had Aisha pinned to his chest and held a knife to her throat. Though she struggled against him, his grip was unshakable. The blade at her neck was beaded red. Mazen stared in horror. He glanced between the men, searching for an opening. He paused, realizing what was missing. Where are your ghouls? He said weakly. Imad stepped forward and pulled open his cloak. Mazen flinched back, but the underside of the cloak was empty. The amulet he had been wearing was gone. Running amok, the thief's voice took on a shrill edge. Your djinn rendered my relic useless. She took control of my ghouls and clouded my mind with her terrible song. A memory flashed through Mazen's mind of the Queen of Dune's song. He recalled the fissure that had opened in his mind to let in memories that were not his. Where had she come from? How was she here? Ahmad took another step forward. Mazen saw a silver glint between his fingers, throwing knives. Now, because of your djinn, I must resort to torture the old-fashioned way. He raised a hand, snapped his fingers. Kill her. Mazen was too busy gripping Luli, too busy fearing for her life, to notice the killer behind Aisha shift. He did not notice the gleam of his knife until it was too late, until it tore a gash into Aisha's throat. There was no scream, no cry, just Aisha's single-eyed gaze boring into him desperately, and then nothing. The spark of panic faded, and Aisha bint Luas collapsed. The world tilted. Mazen was aware of his heartbeat, of breathing in and in and in, of a scream beating wildly in his chest, of the merchant biting her fist so hard blood trickled down her knuckles. Your brother took everything from me. Imad was close enough to stab him, close enough to kill him. Now I shall take everything from him. Mazen couldn't look at Aisha, at her impossibly still body. Get up, he thought desperately. Get up. But Aisha didn't move. She had been so confident, so powerful, an unfaltering force of nature. If she could not survive, how could he? I'm sorry, he whispered, to Aisha, to the merchant. Again the world shook. Mazen stumbled on his feet as the walls shuddered. He no longer had enough strength to hold the merchant, to stand, not even enough to see right. He blinked. The world righted itself. Then, again, it shook, tilted, and cracked. There was a sudden sound. Mazen recognized it as the sigh of cascading sand. Imad turned. Mazen followed his gaze to the web of cracks breaking across the surface of the ancient walls. They spread and stretched like veins, pulsing, thrumming, until the walls burst and a torrent of sand crashed through the room in the form of a gigantic wave. Mazen stumbled back as Imad was swallowed, the world disappearing, replaced by a hazy veil of black. And then there was sand in his eyes and nose and throat, and the merchant was no longer in his arms, and... Gods, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Help! He was sinking, 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 until the sand beneath him gave way, and Mazen fell into nothingness.